You ever wake up in the dead of night, staring at the ceiling while the weight of betrayal presses down on your chest like an invisible hand, making you question every hug and holiday toast from the people who raised you? Realizing that the family you thought was your safety net has been quietly unraveling the threads holding you together, all while propping up someone else, as if your struggles were just background noise in their perfect picture? That's exactly where I found myself, Elena Thompson, a 42-year-old accountant scraping by in the windy chill of suburban Chicago, single mom to my bright-eyed 10-year-old Lily, who deserved better than the ramen dinners and secondhand clothes we'd been making do with since my world flipped upside down 2 years ago, when a routine checkup turned into a nightmare diagnosis of stage 1 breast cancer that sucked the life out of me faster than a Chicago gale, leaving me with surgical scars, chemo side effects that lingered like unwanted guests, and a mountain of medical bills that climbed higher than the Willis Tower, each statement a fresh reminder that the American healthcare system doesn't care about your grit or your tears, it just demands payment or else. I remember the day it all crystallized, sitting in my cramped apartment kitchen with the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, sorting through envelopes stamped with urgent red ink. The totals blurring as exhaustion from another long shift at the firm clashed with the fear gnawing at my insides about how Lily and I might end up on the street if I couldn't keep up, and in that moment of quiet desperation, I picked up the phone to call my parents, retired and sunning themselves in their Florida condo, expecting the kind of support that families in those heartwarming TV ads promise, the ones where parents rally around their kids no matter what, but instead, Mom's voice on the other end carried that familiar hesitation, the kind she'd used back when I was a teen, asking for help with college applications, saying things like, "Oh, Elena, we're sorry to hear that, but the market's been so unpredictable with our investments, and your father and I have our own fixed income to worry about." Even though I'd seen the photos on social media of their recent condo upgrade, complete with granite counters and a view of the Gulf that screamed anything but financial strain, and when I pressed gently, explaining how the out-of-pocket costs for follow-up scans and medications were burying me alive, how Lily's school fees were next on the chopping block, Dad took the phone with his gruff engineer's tone, lecturing me about personal responsibility and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, as if surviving cancer while holding down a job and parenting solo wasn't the epitome of bootstrapping in a country where one medical emergency can wipe out a decade of savings. There was a bitter humor in it all, the kind that bubbles up when life's absurdities hit too close to home, like imagining my parents as characters in one of those sitcoms where the overlooked sibling finally snaps, but back then I swallowed it down, forcing a laugh during the call to keep things light, telling them I'd figure it out because that's what I'd always done. The reliable daughter who moved to the city at 18 with nothing but a backpack and a scholarship, building a life brick by brick without the fanfare my brother Mark always seemed to get just for showing up. Mark, 3 years my senior, the sales manager in Atlanta with the easy smile and the knack for charming everyone from bosses to bill collectors, had been the golden child since we were kids, the one who got the shiny new bike while I made do with hand-me-downs, the one whose college tuition was covered without a second thought while I pieced together loans and night classes, and even now, in my haze of recovery, his texts were sporadic at best, a quick thinking of you after my surgery, followed by radio silence when I hinted at needing advice on navigating insurance appeals, yet somehow he remained the sun around which Mom and Dad orbited, their pride evident in every family gathering anecdote about his latest promotion or big client win. As the weeks dragged into months, my body healing but my bank account hemorrhaging, I mustered the courage for another call, this time attaching scanned copies of the bills to an email, detailing the exact figures, thousands for the lumpectomy, hundreds weekly for anti-nausea meds that barely worked, and the looming threat of collections agencies circling like vultures, and I poured out the reality of it, how I was down to one car payment away from disaster, how Lily had started asking why we couldn't afford the field trip to the museum, but the response was more of the same deflections, Mom suggesting I look into government assistance programs as if that weren't a humiliating step I'd already taken, Dad muttering about tough times for everyone, and Not a single offer of even a temporary lifeline, which left me staring at my computer screen late into the night, the cursor blinking mockingly as I debated typing out the frustration building inside me. The sense that this wasn't just oversight, but something deeper, a favoritism so ingrained it blinded them to my pain. Then came the twist that lit the fuse, a innocent ping from the family group chat I'd been added to years ago, but rarely checked, popping up during a rare evening when Lily was tucked in and I was nursing a cup of herbal tea to settle my stomach. The messages scrolling back to reveal a cascade of excitement over real estate listings, photos of a sprawling vacation home in the Florida Keys with its private dock stretching into turquoise waters, an infinity pool overlooking the horizon, and sleek, modern interiors that screamed luxury escape, complete with captions from Dad proclaiming a well-deserved gift for our son after all his hard work and sacrifices, and Mark responding with effusive gratitude, promising weekend getaways for the whole family, while Mom chimed in about how it would be the perfect spot for holidays, all of this unfolding mere days after my plea for help had gone unanswered. The contrast so stark it felt like a cruel joke scripted by some cosmic comedian who thought sibling rivalry needed an extra layer of financial farce. My hands trembled as I zoomed in on the details, the purchase price hinted at in one message hovering around $500,000, enough to erase my debts 10 times over and still leave room for Lily's college fund. Yet here they were, prioritizing Mark's reward over my survival, and the light vulgarity of it all hit me then. The way they'd gloss over my health issue in the chat like it was a minor inconvenience, not worth disrupting their grand gesture. Mom even typing, "Elena's doing okay, let's not burden her with this news just yet," as if shielding me from joy while letting my reality crumble. And in that instant, a quiet resolve settled in, the first whisper of walking away from the toxicity that had masqueraded as love for so long. But as I closed the app and glanced at the bills stacked nearby, a nagging uncertainty crept in. Wondering if there were hidden reasons behind their choices, unspoken histories or pressures that made Mark the repository of their generosity. And just as I thought I'd pieced together the betrayal, another notification buzzed. This one a forwarded email from Mark to our parents that I wasn't meant to see. Its subject line reading family support plan, hinting at conversations I'd been excluded from, leaving me frozen in place, heart racing with the possibility that the real story, the one that could either mend or shatter us forever, was only beginning to surface. That forwarded email from Mark lingered in my mind like a bad aftertaste after a family potluck where someone sneaks in the wrong dish, its contents a vague outline of what he called a support plan for Mom and Dad's retirement, mentioning assets and contingencies in ways that made my stomach twist because it excluded any reference to my situation, as if my medical battles were a footnote not worth inking. And as the days blurred into a routine of hospital visits, work deadlines, and Lily's school projects that I helped with despite the fatigue pulling at my limbs like invisible weights, I couldn't shake the growing suspicion that the favoritism ran deeper than surface-level pride in Mark's career. Perhaps rooted in some unspoken pact or past mistake they'd all agreed to bury under layers of denial and deflection, so I decided to probe gently during our next phone call with Mom, framing it as casual curiosity about the Keys house while Lily colored quietly in the background, her crayon scratching out pictures of beaches we'd never visited. And when I mentioned hearing whispers of the purchase through mutual friends, Mom's tone shifted to that overly cheerful lilt she used when skirting uncomfortable truths, downplaying it as a modest investment property meant for family gatherings, insisting it wasn't extravagant despite the photos I'd seen showing marble floors and ocean views that mocked my threadbare living room carpet worn thin from years of pacing during anxious nights. I let the conversation flow naturally at first, sharing updates on my recovery to keep things light, describing how the latest scan showed no recurrence, but the bills continued to arrive like unwelcome relatives crashing a party, each one itemizing costs for therapies and checkups that insurance deemed elective in their cold bureaucratic language. And then I eased into the ask, explaining how a couple $1,000s could prevent the hospital from turning my account over to collections, potentially tanking my credit score and jeopardizing the stability Lily and I had fought so hard to maintain in a city where rents climbed faster than Midwestern corn in summer. But Mom hesitated again, her voice trailing off into excuses about unexpected home repairs and the volatility of their stock portfolio, even though Dad's pension from decades at the engineering firm should have provided a buffer. And when I gently reminded her of the family chat glimpses I'd caught, she sighed heavily, admitting the house was indeed a gift to Mark for his recent promotion that involved relocating his team and boosting company sales, framing it as a reward for his sacrifices while implying mine didn't qualify because I'd always been the self-sufficient one, the daughter who didn't need hand-holding like her fragile son apparently did. The irony wasn't lost on me, a wry amusement bubbling up at the thought of Mark, with his corner office and company car, being painted as the vulnerable one while I juggled spreadsheets at work and bedtime stories at home without a safety net, but I pushed back softly, asking if they could at least discuss it with Dad, only for her to pass the phone where he launched into another lecture on fiscal responsibility, recounting stories from his own youth about working 2 jobs during the oil crisis of the 70s. As if my cancer fight wasn't a modern equivalent of battling economic storms, and by the end of the call, with no promises forthcoming, I hung up feeling more isolated than ever, the walls of my apartment closing in as I stared at the calendar marking another payment due date, wondering how long I could keep pretending this was just a rough patch rather than a deliberate sidelining by the people who'd taught me the value of family first. Desperation mixed with determination led me to dig deeper that weekend, while Lily visited her dad for a rare custody weekend, leaving me alone with my laptop and a pot of coffee. Strong enough to wake the dead, scrolling through archived emails from years past that I'd saved in a folder labeled Family Stuff, and there, buried under threads about holiday plans and birthday wishes, was that old attachment from Mom about Dad's preliminary will. The one with handwritten notes in the margins adjusting shares based on contributions to family stability, a phrase that now screamed favoritism when applied to Mark's history of bouncing between jobs in his 20s while I steadily climbed the corporate ladder without fanfare or bailouts, and reading it anew, I felt a surge of validation mixed with anger, realizing this pattern had been simmering for decades, not just a recent slight amid my illness. Yet the document offered no clear motive, only hints of deeper resentments or secrets that might explain why they'd always propped him up at my expense, like the time in high school when his car wreck led to them dipping into savings without telling me, or the college years when his tuition hikes were covered silently while mine required endless applications for aid. That discovery fueled a small act of rebellion, the first real taste of pushing back without exploding bridges, as I crafted a neutral email to the family group sharing an article I'd found on sibling equity in parental support, complete with statistics about how uneven financial help erodes trust over time, positioning it as educational rather than accusatory to avoid immediate backlash, and the responses trickled in slowly, Mom with a polite acknowledgement, Dad ignoring it entirely, but Mark firing off a private message asking what I was getting at, to which I replied with feigned innocence that it was merely food for thought in these trying times, the subtext landing like a well-aimed dart because I could almost hear his discomfort through the screen. Knowing it pricked at the conscience he rarely consulted. Still, the victory felt hollow as the bills mounted and Lily returned, chattering about her time away, oblivious to the undercurrents threatening our little world, and in the quiet evenings that followed, doubts crept in about whether confronting them head-on would heal anything or just widen the chasm, especially when Aunt Rita, Mom's estranged sister who'd always been the family's truth-teller, called out of the blue suggesting we meet for coffee in Milwaukee, her voice carrying a weight that hinted at knowledge beyond what I'd uncovered, mentioning offhand a faded photograph from our childhood lake trips that showed Dad's arm draped protectively over Mark while I stood apart, and as she described it, promising to share more in person. A chill ran down my spine because it suggested the cracks in our foundation weren't new but foundational, built on choices that predated my diagnosis by years. leaving me to wonder as I agreed to the visit what buried truths she held that could either vindicate my growing resolve to distance myself or force me to reevaluate the loyalty I'd clung to for so long. And just as I thought I'd steadied myself against the uncertainty, another email pinged in from Mark, this one accidentally CC'd to me, discussing with a financial advisor ways to leverage the Keys property for tax benefits, revealing layers of privilege I hadn't fully grasped, propelling me toward that meeting with Rita where the real unraveling might begin. Aunt Rita's invitation to meet hung over me like the persistent drizzle of a Midwest spring that soaks through your coat before you realize you're drenched, pulling me northward to Milwaukee under the guise of a weekend errand while Lily stayed with a trusted neighbor. Her innocent questions about why I seemed so tense only amplifying the knot in my stomach as I navigated the highway miles from Chicago, replaying that accidental email from Mark about leveraging the Keys house for tax advantages that would benefit him and our parents, while my own financial tightrope act grew ever more precarious, with each new medical invoice landing in my mailbox like clockwork reminders of a system designed to punish the already weary. And by the time I pulled into the parking lot of her modest bungalow on a tree-lined street that whispered of quieter lives untouched by family dramas, the uncertainty had woven itself into every thought, making me question if unearthing more truths would fortify my resolve or simply multiply the pain of realizing how long I'd been navigating these shadows alone. Rita greeted me at the door with her trademark no-nonsense hug, the kind that conveyed understanding without pity. And over mugs of steaming chamomile tea in her cluttered living room filled with shelves of faded photo albums and knickknacks from decades of teaching high school history, she laid out the photograph she'd mentioned on the phone. A yellowed snapshot from our family's annual lake outings in the 80s showing 8-year-old me standing awkwardly on the sandy shore in a hand-me-down swimsuit while Dad's arm encircled 10-year-old Mark protectively as they both grinned at the camera, Mom in the background unpacking a cooler with that forced smile she wore during tense moments, and as Rita pointed out the subtle details, the way Dad's gaze lingered on Mark with an intensity that bordered on overcompensation, the absence of any similar gesture toward me even in the frames edges, it struck me how those early imbalances had set the tone for everything that followed, from the uneven allowances that left me budgeting for school dances while Mark splurged on video games, to the college decisions where his path was paved with encouragement and mine carved through sheer willpower. Yet Rita went further, sharing snippets from letters she'd exchanged with Mom back then, hinting at Dad's lingering guilt over a workplace incident in the 70s that had briefly put financial strain on the family, one where Mark, even as a toddler, had been shielded from the fallout while I, the older child, absorbed the quiet tensions without explanation, suggesting that this pattern of overprotecting him stemmed from a fear of repeating past vulnerabilities rather than any fault of mine. But even as her words painted a picture of well-intentioned but misguided parenting, they didn't erase the sting of present-day neglect, especially when she mentioned overhearing conversations during family visits about how Mark's fragility, after a rough patch in his early career, had prompted them to double down on support, framing my independence as a strength that meant I needed less, a logic that now felt like a convenient excuse for sidelining my cries for help amid the cancer storm. The revelations swirled in my head during the drive back, a mix of empathy for their flawed choices and fresh anger at how those choices had cascaded into the current crisis, where a luxury vacation home symbolized not just favoritism, but a willful blindness to my unraveling life, and that internal tug-of-war intensified when the invitation arrived for a family dinner at Mom and Dad's Florida condo, framed as a belated celebration of my recovery milestone, but timed suspiciously after my subtle email about financial equity had stirred the group chat into awkward silences, prompting me to book flights for Lily and me despite the cost, dipping further into my emergency fund, telling myself it was an opportunity to bridge the gap or at least gauge if Rita's insights could spark a real conversation, though deep down the growing conflict whispered that this gathering might expose more lies than mending wounds, especially with Mark and his wife Jenna attending. their presence a reminder of the charmed bubble they'd built on foundations I'd helped shore up unknowingly over the years. The humid Florida air enveloped us upon arrival, thick with the scent of hibiscus and salt from the nearby Gulf. As we settled into the condo's guest room with its crisp linens and ocean view balcony that mocked the view from my Chicago apartment of a parking lot and distant skyline, and the dinner itself unfolded around a polished glass table laden with fresh seafood and sides that Mom had prepared with her usual flair, the clink of silverware punctuating stories of neighborhood barbecues and golf outings that Dad dominated, his laughter booming as he recounted Mark's latest sales triumph involving a major client in the Southeast, while Jenna chimed in with anecdotes about decorating the Keys house, describing sunset views from the infinity pool and plans for a family Christmas there that included everyone except, it seemed, acknowledging the barriers keeping Lily and me from joining, and I sat there nodding along, forcing smiles as Lily excitedly asked about the beach, her innocence a stark contrast to the undercurrents I felt bubbling beneath the surface pleasantries. Until a lull in the conversation allowed me to steer toward the elephant in the room, casually inquiring about their financial outlook now that the new property was in play, watching Mom's fork hover midair as she deflected with talk of steady pensions and careful budgeting. But when I mentioned my ongoing bills in the context of family support, the atmosphere shifted palpably, Dad clearing his throat to emphasize how they'd always rewarded tangible contributions, like Mark's business acumen that indirectly benefited the family's retirement planning, a vague claim that prompted Jenna, perhaps loosened by a second glass of Chardonnay, to let slip that Mark had been quietly advising on my medical appeals behind the scenes to spare our parents additional stress. A revelation that landed like a poorly aimed curveball because I'd never heard of such efforts, my own attempts at insurance negotiations yielding nothing but denials, and suddenly the pieces Rita had shared clicked with this new twist, suggesting Mark's involvement wasn't helpful but complicit in downplaying my needs to maintain his favored status, the humor of the moment striking me darkly as I imagined him playing White Knight in a narrative scripted solely for their approval, prompting me to quip lightly about how his assists must have gotten lost in the mail alongside my bill payments, eliciting awkward chuckles that masked the tension rippling across the table like heat waves off asphalt. Later, as Lily played with seashells on the patio under the twilight sky, I pulled Mom aside in the kitchen amid the aroma of cooling pie, confronting her directly about the favoritism Rita had illuminated, asking why Mark's supposed fragility warranted a $500,000 safety net while my proven resilience left me drowning, and her response, a weary sigh coupled with insistence that I was the strong one who could weather any storm without their interference, only deepened the rift, framing my demands as selfishness rather than survival, leaving me to retreat to the guest room that night with a resolve hardening like concrete, the revenge taking shape not in shouts, but in subtlety as I drafted a social media post the next morning before breakfast. A throwback image of Lily and me at a local Chicago beach with a caption about forging our own paths to paradise through perseverance rather than handouts, sharing it publicly where family connections would see it without direct tags. The likes and shares from extended relatives sparking private messages questioning the family dynamics, and when Mark called later that day during our flight home, his tone edged with irritation about the passive-aggressive vibe, I replied with calm wit that it was simply celebrating our independence, the satisfaction of that indirect jab warming me as it sowed seeds of doubt in their unified front. But the true cliffhanger emerged upon landing when Rita texted coordinates for an urgent follow-up meeting, promising documents from Mom and Dad's early marriage that tied Mark's favoritism to a long-buried financial scandal involving Dad's engineering firm, papers that could rewrite everything I thought I knew about our bonds and force a reckoning I wasn't sure my heart could handle, leaving me staring at my phone in the airport bustle, the weight of impending revelations pressing heavier than any medical debt ever had. Rita's urgent text about documents from Mom and Dad's early marriage pulled me back into the whirlwind of revelations just as the sting from that Florida dinner lingered like the afterburn of spicy takeout you regret but can't stop craving. So I arranged another clandestine meeting in Milwaukee the following weekend, dropping Lily off at a friend's for a sleepover with promises of arcade fun to mask my distraction, and as I sped up the interstate once more, the folder from our last encounter tucked securely in my passenger seat, my mind raced through the implications of what she might unveil, wondering if these papers would expose not just favoritism, but a deliberate orchestration of family resources that had always tilted the scales toward Mark, leaving me to navigate the fallout of their choices in isolation, especially now with a fresh hospital letter demanding full payment on an outstanding balance or face legal action that could garnish my wages and upend the fragile stability I'd rebuilt post-treatment. The kind of threat that amplified every doubt about whether family ties were worth the emotional toll when they offered no practical lifeline amid the relentless grind of American middle-class survival, where one health crisis can cascade into years of debt servitude. We met again in her attic this time, the air thick with dust motes dancing in the slanted light filtering through a small window, and Rita handed over a weathered envelope sealed with yellowed tape, its contents spilling out as faded bank statements and correspondence from the late 80s detailing Dad's involvement in a minor engineering firm scandal where cost overruns on a government contract led to internal audits and quiet settlements. But the real bombshell lay in the annotations, showing how Dad had siphoned small amounts from the family's joint savings to cover personal liabilities without Mom's full knowledge, channeling the recovered funds preferentially toward Mark's upbringing as a way to atone for the stress it caused during my toddler years, when I was the one old enough to sense the household tensions manifesting in skipped meals and whispered arguments, while Mark, the baby of the family, remained blissfully insulated in a bubble of extra toys and preschool enrollments that they justified as investments in his future potential, and Rita explained with her historian's precision how this pattern evolved into a subconscious code, where any whiff of financial risk prompted overcompensation for Mark to avoid repeating the perceived failures of that era, even as it meant underinvesting in me, the resilient daughter who learned early to fend for herself without complaint. A dynamic that now explained the Keyes house not as random generosity, but as an echo of that old protective instinct, amplified by Mark's own early career stumbles like the failed startup in his 20s that Dad had quietly bankrolled to keep him from spiraling, all while I powered through my accounting degree on merit scholarships and part-time gigs, unaware that my independence was being weaponized against me in their narrative of who deserved more. The weight of those documents settled over me like a heavy quilt on a sweltering night, offering clarity that bred more turmoil because confronting them with this evidence risked not just rejection, but potential legal entanglements if Dad's past indiscretions surfaced publicly. Yet, swallowing it whole felt like complicity in the very lies that had fueled my medical debt crisis, a dilemma that sharpened when I returned home to find Mom's voicemail waiting, her voice laced with that familiar blend of concern and deflection, inviting me to another family call to discuss clearing the air about the dinner tensions, but laced with subtle blame for my social media post that had garnered comments from cousins questioning the equity of parental support, prompting me to dial in hesitantly only to hear Dad reiterate their stretched finances due to property taxes on both the condo and the Keyes place, glossing over the $500,000 purchase as a savvy long-term asset, while Mark echoed agreement from Atlanta, his tone overly conciliatory, as if sensing the shifting ground. And in that moment, the growing conflict crested as I uncovered yet another twist through a misplaced attachment in Mark's latest email, one he'd meant for his advisor, but accidentally forwarded to me during a group thread about holiday plans, revealing consultations on depreciating the vacation home for tax write-offs that effectively subsidized his lifestyle, while hinting at inflated income reports to justify the parental gift. A light vulgarity in the audacity of it all striking me as I pictured him lounging by that infinity pool, toasting to family blessings built on foundations cracked by selective truths. That discovery ignited a spark of vengeful ingenuity, not the explosive kind that scorches earth, but a calculated maneuver born of my accounting expertise, as I spent the next few evenings after Lily's bedtime restructuring my personal finances with the help of a low-cost online advisor, consolidating debts into a manageable payment plan that bought me breathing room and even accrued a small refund from overlooked insurance reimbursements. Then channeling that momentum into an anonymous tip to a Florida real estate watchdog site about irregular funding sources for high-end vacation properties in the Keys, citing public records on the purchase without naming names, but timing it to coincide with Mark's rental listings going live. The resulting article buzzing through local forums and prompting inquiries that had Mark blowing up my phone with frantic questions about whether I'd stooped to sabotage, to which I responded with feigned surprise and a witty deflection about how transparency in real estate was just good citizenship in these litigious times, the satisfaction of that indirect reckoning warming me like a shot of whiskey on a cold night because it forced them to confront the optics of their choices without me lifting a finger in accusation, sowing unease in their ranks as Mom's calls grew more frequent, laced with pleas for unity that masked accusations of my growing bitterness, while Dad sent a curt text about respecting family privacy, their united front fracturing just enough to reveal the individual guilts beneath. Yet, even as that revenge provided a cathartic lift, the isolation deepened with Lily picking up on my withdrawn moods during our evening routines, her small hand slipping into mine as she asked if Grandma and Grandpa were mad at us for wanting to visit the beach house, a question that pierced deeper than any bill collector's notice because it highlighted how their neglect rippled outward to the one innocent in this mess, compelling me to weigh the cost of further pursuit against the peace of detachment, especially when Rita followed up with warnings that the documents hinted at more recent entanglements, like Mark's role in advising Dad on retirement investments that might border on impropriety, leaving me to ponder in the quiet hours if exposing it all would liberate or merely entomb us in resentment. And just as I teetered on that edge, deciding to hold off on deeper confrontation until I could verify the claims, my phone lit up late one evening with an incoming call from Mark himself, his voice thick with uncharacteristic urgency as he insisted we talk immediately. About the house, the money trails, and a truth about Mom and Dad's decisions that he'd kept buried even from me. The desperation in his tone suggesting a breaking point that could either draw us into reconciliation or propel me fully into the walkaway I'd been inching toward, leaving me gripping the receiver in the dim light of my kitchen, the shadows of tangled lies stretching longer than ever before. Mark's late-night call shattered the fragile calm I'd carved out in the dim glow of my kitchen light, his voice cracking with a vulnerability I'd rarely heard since we were kids building forts in the backyard, insisting we meet halfway in an Ohio diner off the interstate the very next day to hash out the tangled web of money, the house, and truths about Mom and Dad that he'd shielded not just from me but from himself for years, leaving me tossing in bed afterward with Lily's soft snores filtering from her room as a reminder of why I couldn't let this fester indefinitely, the uncertainty gnawing at whether his desperation signaled genuine remorse or a desperate bid to contain the fallout from my anonymous tip that had real estate blogs buzzing about questionable vacation property financings in the Keys, potentially drawing unwanted scrutiny to their prized investment and forcing Mark to confront how his privileges rested on foundations as shaky as the scandal Rita's documents had unearthed from Dad's past. Morning came too soon, with Lily waving goodbye from school drop off her backpack slung over one shoulder as she chattered about a science project on ecosystems that ironically mirrored the delicate balance of our family dynamics now teetering on collapse. And I drove east through the rolling farmlands of Indiana, the folder of evidence riding shotgun like a silent co-conspirator, my mind replaying fragments of conversations from the Florida dinner where Jenna's slip and Mom's deflections had hinted at layers deeper than mere favoritism, perhaps tied to Dad's engineering firm troubles where covering for Mark's early indiscretions had become a family habit, one that extended to quietly rerouting resources during my cancer fight to maintain the illusion of stability for their golden child while I battled alone in the trenches of treatment and bills that threatened to foreclose on the life Lily and I had built brick by painstaking brick in the unforgiving landscape of urban Chicago living. The diner was a nondescript spot with vinyl booths cracked from years of use and the sizzle of greasy spoons on the grill providing a neutral backdrop as Mark slid into the seat across from me nursing a black coffee, his eyes shadowed by what looked like sleepless nights. And without preamble he dove in, admitting he'd known about the college fund diversion 2 decades ago when Dad pulled strings to cover his botched business venture in his 20s, a minor fraud allegation swept under the rug. With family savings that included portions earmarked for my education, staying silent because speaking up would have unraveled the narrative of his success that Mom and Dad clung to like a lifeline. Especially after the firm scandal where Dad's overzealous contract bidding had nearly cost them everything, positioning Mark as the one to redeem the family legacy through his sales prowess, while I was cast as the steady outsider who wouldn't rock the boat, and as he laid it bare, the twist deepened with his confession that the Keys house wasn't pure generosity, but a strategic asset to launder lingering debts from those old cover-ups. Structured through Mark's financial advice to Dad in ways that skirted tax implications and provided a buffer against any audits that might resurface the past, all of which explained why my medical pleas had been met with silence. Not out of malice, but a fear-driven calculus where supporting me openly risked exposing the imbalances they'd buried to protect their retirement dreams and Mark's facade of invincibility. Hearing it from him hit differently than Rita's second-hand accounts, stirring a maelstrom of emotions from pity for the boy who'd been burdened with their projections to fury at how that burden had been offloaded onto me. The sister left to prove her worth through endurance rather than inheritance, and the dilemma crystallized in that booth as I weighed forgiving this complicity against the irreparable harm it had wrought on my health and Lily's security, the growing conflict manifesting in my voice, as I described the nights I'd lain awake calculating survival odds not just from cancer, but from the financial freefall their neglect accelerated, prompting Mark to reach across the table with an apology that felt raw yet incomplete, suggesting we loop in Mom and Dad for a full family mediation to redistribute some assets fairly. But even as he spoke, the uncertainty loomed large because trust, once eroded like coastal bluffs against relentless waves, couldn't be rebuilt with words alone, especially when the light vulgarity of their choices struck me anew in how they'd romanticized Mark's fragility to justify a lifestyle that mocked my grit. Mom and Dad arrived shortly after, summoned by Mark's urgent text, their faces etched with a mix of apprehension and defensiveness as they squeezed into the booth, the air thickening with the scent of frying bacon and unspoken accusations, and I laid out the evidence methodically, starting with the group chat screenshots juxtaposed against my bill statements, moving to Rita's documents on the fund diversions, and culminating in Mark's admissions about the house's ulterior purposes. Watching Dad's engineer precision falter as he mumbled about protecting the family image during tough times like the 70s recession and the firm's near collapse, while Mom's eyes welled with tears insisting their love was equal, but expressed differently, me as the independent warrior and Mark as the one needing bolstering, a rationale that rang hollow against the $500,000 chasm between our realities, and in that charged exchange. The atmosphere pulsed with impending revenge not as destruction, but as a precise reclamation, for I'd spent the drive consulting my own financial contacts, quietly preparing a legal claim on the misappropriated college fund portion, traceable through the old statements and now bolstered by Mark's confessions. Estimating a recovery of around $15,000 that could wipe out my remaining medical debts and seed a proper college fund for Lily, announcing it calmly as my line in the sand, not for vengeance, but for the balance they'd denied. Specifying that pursuing it through small claims would force a review of the Keys properties funding without naming outright scandal, leaving them to grapple with the consequences of their selective generosity in a system where equity demands accountability. The witty edge in delivering it with a nod to Dad's bootstraps philosophy turned back on them, providing a satisfying undercurrent of justice that had Mark paling at the potential ripple effects on his rentals and Dad shifting uncomfortably as if recalculating his own ledgers. As the meeting dissolved into strained hugs and promises of further talks, with Mom pressing a check for $5,000 into my hand as an immediate gesture, her hands trembling slightly, I drove back west with a lightness tempered by lingering shadows, The partial truths unearthed, offering closure yet raising new questions about whether their belated efforts stemmed from genuine change or fear of exposure, and arriving home to Lily's excited recounting of her day. Her arms wrapping around me in unfiltered affection, I pondered the ambiguity of it all in the quiet evening hours, wondering if walking away fully severed the echoes of what could have been a supportive family, or if faint threads of reconciliation might weave back in time, especially when Mark's follow-up text arrived suggesting therapy sessions for all of us to unpack the favoritism's roots, a proposal that tempted with possibility but warned of more pain ahead. Leaving me to stare at the screen long after Lily slept, the weight of choices pressing as heavily as any bill ever had, because in the end, family bonds twisted by secrets and neglect don't untangle neatly, prompting the eternal query of whether salvaging them is worth the scars or if true freedom lies in forging ahead alone, a thought that hangs unresolved like the final note of a song you can't quite forget.